Wondering how your mindset affects your life? How to bring more energy into your business and life? Millions of people around the world ask these same questions daily. You are in the right place. Learn practices that will help give your life the meaning and success you've been searching for. Welcome to the Charge Podcast, teaching you how to create habits around real goals every day. Practical life advice from those who made it. Here's your host, Gary Wilbers.
Chargers, welcome back again this week for another great podcast. Man, I love sharing our podcast with you, and I truly appreciate you keep sharing the podcast with people that want to come on. Now, I've got one favor I need to ask you. If you would you rate and review our podcast on whatever channel that you listen to the podcast? Because that helps other people see it. We are close to having all 50 states in the United States that have listened to the podcast. We have over 50 countries that have listened in different countries. So my goal is we're going to, in 2020, get all 50 states also. So we just truly appreciate you and thank you for sharing the podcast and letting others know about it. And Chargers, what do you do each day to kind of learn something new? That's through these podcasts. So I want to share with you today, how can we learn something new about the different generations in the workforce? Because I will tell you, it's challenging today because there's multiple generations in the workforce. And what can we do to be able to better understand someone that's not in the generation that I am? We're all a little bit different, but guess what? We're all the same too. So the key is, how can we create that workplace synergy in the workplace, no matter what age our coworkers are? So today I've brought on that expert. So that's the reason I was plugging that like that. Jeff Butler is the author of 2 provocative books, The Authentic Workplace and The Key to the New You. Having written over 100 articles on workplace dynamics, his insights have been featured in dozens of media outlets such as Forbes and HR News. In addition, he has appeared on TEDx in both 2016 and 2017, with both talks focusing on psychology. Before Jeff founded his workplace consulting company, he spent almost a decade in Silicon Valley working as a software engineer, which is where his initial interest in organizational psychology began to develop. Since then, he has personally addressed over 100 organizations internationally on workplace dynamics issues such as Google, Amazon, LinkedIn, Wells Fargo, and he lives in Boston, Massachusetts with his family. Jeff, it is great to have you on the Charge Podcast.
Great. It's great to be here, Gary.
Well, we are so excited about this, and I'm excited about this topic because I think you and I spoke once before, and I saw you speak at an event that I was attending also about millennials and workplace generations. And I just think this is a topic that's so important right now, because how are we building those generational gaps in these workplace environments? Because we have to understand how we work together. That brings the strength instead of a weakness. So I am excited about this podcast to be able to share this with my audience. Now, before we go there, though, I have a mantra called Charge. Create habits around real goals every day. Now, you've created some success in your life by writing a couple books, articles, doing TEDx's. What is one of those habits or habits that you've had that you think's created some of that success for you?
Yeah, there's a lot of habits out there, but there's really one weird one that I'm sure someone has mentioned it to you on the podcast before. But for me, it's totally changed my life. And the one thing I do, I make sure even if I have no food or I'm in the middle of travel or wherever I am, I always have a notebook with me and I write down my goals first thing. I always do that. And I don't know why, but ever since I started doing that, I became very focused on what that is. And I actually started hitting down those goals and making them happen. It's simple. It's pretty simple, but Gary, you've had someone say that before, right? Or am I the first person?
Nope, you're not the first. I've heard that before. And James Clear talks about in his book, Atomic Habits, how important that is when you start writing them down, it just brings them forefront. I've got a quote that I always use: goals is like having your headlights on because you know where you're going now.
Yeah, definitely. And so that just completely transformed and helped focus in on my life, where I actually need to go and what I need to do.
Well, I call my audience the Chargers, so I hope they've heard that because we've talked a lot about here in 2020. Let's go out and achieve our goals we have. Well, one of the ways you can do that is start writing them down, and every day kind of visualizing yourself in those and writing those down and taking that action that will move you forward. Jeff, to get started in our conversation, I wrote a book called 21 Ways to Attract, Retain, and Engage Millennials. But this doesn't apply to that, and it's not my part, but I put this in the book, and I want to share this with you, and it's going to kind of start our conversation on kind of those building those generational gaps, because it's about generations, not just about one. And here's the quote. The world is passing through troublous times. The young people of today think of nothing but themselves. They have no reverence for parents or old age. They are impatient of all restraint. They talk as if they know everything, and what passes for wisdom with us is foolishness with them. Peter the Hermit wrote that in 1274. So I'm sick of hearing that generation is so different. The challenge is we have to understand every generation is different. So I kind of want to get your take on that and kind of let you start in with, as you want to talk about building generational gaps, how important that is.
Yeah, and it's a great quote that you have there. I would sometimes cite Socrates in my presentations, which is in BC, on a very similar vein of him complaining about the younger generation. And it's a very continuous thing that happens, is that people who, regardless of where they are in history, there's always a tension between older and younger. That's just what happens in general. And to think that it's brand new is completely bogus. There are some things, though, that create differences today larger than they ever have been in history. But we can go into that probably in a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's the key, is what are some of those differences? We've talked about those factors really that we talk about. What creates some of those generation rifts on teams that you see when you're out there working in the workplace?
Hands down, number one thing comes down to expectations. Whether it's someone who's younger who thinks they don't have to work as hard, someone who's more senior thinking that they only have to put in 10 hours a week because they've been there for 40 years, whatever it may be, when there's team conflict, it comes down to what people are expecting of each other and that not being met. So different ways you can look at it is, how do you communicate on the team? Do you use phone? Do you use email? Work ethic. Do you have to show up to the office for, say, 10 hours, 9 hours, or can you get it done while you're at home? Each generation is going to have a different perspective. In fact, each person will. So the goal of, say, a leader in that team is, how do you actually consolidate those differences of expectations into one language that pertains to that current team?
Yeah, I think that becomes the real key, is how do we start to understand those real differences that's there, and how do we set those? And a lot of it comes in, I think that very first one you said, is what's our expectations? And I think that's maybe an area that I believe is a little bit weak, is our leaders just expect you to know versus them really sharing what is expected and what's kind of the obligation that's here. And I don't know if you're seeing some of that same aspect of it, is just like you're supposed to be ingrained in it. And most people need to be told what is expected of them in the workplace.
Yep. Well, it sounds weird because a relationship in the workplace is just like a relationship, like a romantic relationship. Each person has their own expectations of what the relationship means. And where you get into conflict is that when two different people think there's two different expectations. So I don't think it's necessarily about the workplace. It's just about people in general. And when the workplace gets complicated, is that you get a diverse group of people and you have to align their actions to one common goal.
Yeah, and that's really what sets a business apart, is the people that can align everyone. They get greater synergy. I talk about culture, and it comes in a part of what you're talking about too in the workplace of those generational gaps, is building the culture, is getting people to understand each other. So what's some strategies that you use or you share with your teams that they can really set those expectations and get people to understand their differences more, what's some of those things that you offer to your organizations when you're working with them that can make some of those differences?
Yeah, first is identifying where those gray areas are. So where are those specific issues? So let's say it's a work ethic, right? And if work ethic, that usually falls into workplace flexibility. In terms of departments, who is allowed to take what time off? Where is that explicitly stated? Making sure that there's a level of equality across the board. You have things such as culture. And one of the things that people get really frustrated with right now is that there's different expectations of communication, but a lot of that stems from cultural differences. And if you don't address those up front and have that conversation with everyone on the team of, hey, here's how we act in this environment, people are not going to be aligned. Now, a tangible example of this is I have some people who are from the Philippines on my team. And in their culture, you don't speak up to a boss. No matter how bad it is, you take care of it. Unless they're about to quit, say something. And what's really weird and tough for me as an employer, I had someone quit on me this past week, and part of it was that they said, I'm really burned out. Now, they had another job they were working, and they were doing 2 big jobs for me. And I said, well, you've been working for me for 2 years. Why haven't you said anything? And the problem was, in their culture, it's you don't say if there's a problem unless it's the absolute maximum issue. And unfortunately, sometimes even when you do put down those boundaries, people still struggle to come to that consensus. So I guess that story, the moral of the story is saying, there's going to be a culture clash no matter what. And a lot of times, if you're from, say, the United States, you might not know that explicitly. Like in terms of emotionally or in the workplace, we're a lot more direct than other cultures. Or like maybe in Asian cultures, you're not allowed to, or like in the classroom, it's okay to be called on. In Western, you have to raise your hand if you want to be called on. So it's all that variety. And so part of it is just seeing what those differences are and then bringing that to a consolidated agreement.
Yeah, and it's really bringing it through an open discussion of communication. I talk about in areas that I speak on is a lot of times the workplace communication is the number one hidden thing, and it falls in with what we're talking about with generational gaps because we just think people should understand, should know, and we forget that there's basically 4 styles of communication styles out there. And we all have one of the 4. We can adjust to any of those other styles, but we normally like to be communicated on a certain style. And it's the same way when we're talking about generations. They have their style, and we have to set those expectations and how we want to communicate and how an organization does it. And it's one of the things I think is so critical for a leader. The better the leader communicates, the better the leader gets more success in his group. And I do a lot of small business work, Jeff, and with my small business work, there's an easy philosophy to look at, and it works in larger teams too. The greater you take care of your people so they understand your systems, they understand what's offered, they understand the different generations in the workforce, kind of what those expectations are, the greater performance that happens. And when you have greater performance, you normally traditionally get greater profits. And of course, right, the return effect happens also if the people aren't taken care of, they don't understand, they're not communicated with, don't understand the expectations, performance decreases, profits decrease. And we see this in workplaces all the time. So in those gaps that's there, what are you seeing that we can continue to do? Because ultimately you talk about creating leaders who want to build cohesive teams. How can we continue to build those cohesive teams with each other?
Well, part of it comes down to the awareness, right? Understanding aspects such as Adam's equity theory, which goes into that everyone in every environment is trying to maintain some sense of fairness. So with that awareness, you can look at your team and say, well, with the people here, what sort of things are, say, not fair in their particular environment? Because if someone thinks they're not fair, then performance drops. Just a natural output. Like if someone's working half the time you are and they're getting the same pay, you're going to decrease your performance. So there's that side of things. I do think that you're hit the nail on the head with communication, though I think communication is a very commonly used word that can mean a lot of different things. It could be you're communicating the vision to the team, but there's also you sitting down and listening to someone in a one-on-one meeting and communicating with them to make them feel heard. So communication can branch a lot of different sides of things. So there's those sides. I would also look at the cultural differences and the side of understanding that when groups first meet, so let's say you have different generations in the workplace, chances are they're not going to be able to get along if they're in the same hierarchy, or actually different levels of the hierarchy, because you have power games in there. And this goes into all port conditions of when in intergroup contact theory and sociology, when do different groups first meet, how do they get together cohesively and work along side by side? And there's 4 conditions for that. There's the equal status, working towards a common goal. 3 is cooperatively. And the 4th, that there's institutional support. As a leader, if you're going to work with different generations, you need to realize, like, look, we're not in an equal status environment. How can we equalize this? And what a lot of companies have done is going outside of the workplace, maybe doing some sort of volunteering time off to get people in that out of the workplace context to start breaking down those generational differences. So those are a couple things that leaders can do in order to overcome those generation boundaries.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. I think that becomes the real key, because we've got to break those barriers down, because otherwise you can't get the synergy on your team, whatever word you want to use. You can't get the cooperation there. You can't create the whole cohesiveness that's there. We've got to be able to find ways, how can we work that? The other thing is, leaders, we've got to understand we've got to do a better job. Really, how do we bring this forward in the workplace? And I think that's the realization that our leadership, it's different today than it was 20 years ago. But in a lot of ways, it's still similar. But the difference is the marketplace is different than it was before. And it's almost the same thing as was saying in the quote from Peter the Hermit. You know, things have passed. Things are different. Our communication style is different. We have to look at them in different ways each and every time. So when we're looking at those generational differences, we as a leader have got to understand those and be able to appreciate those differences that's there. Because the thing is, I had my 19-year-old, 20-year-old son now, he's close to be 21, in here a while ago, helping me shoot a video. And, you know, within minutes, he was able to have everything set up. For somebody like me, yep. I'm the old guy, you know. It takes me a long time to be able to get set up and ready to go, and he had it set up in no time. They can do things that other people can't. We got to appreciate those differences that's there. So can you kind of expand on really how can we take that younger generation and what you're seeing? And, you know, I'm tired of, you know, it's about the millennials. It's really about what the marketplace demands now in the marketplace. And now we've got the next generation coming in. You better figure it out, because otherwise you're going to be out of business. Right.
And the way I look at it is, you need to bring in new blood into your business, and whether or not they're different or not doesn't really matter as much as can they get the job done. And if they're a millennial, Generation Z, or if they're from a different country, it doesn't really matter. So that's the principle I have is, look, if your company is so easy that you have time to worry about that, like, there's something definitely wrong. And the question that you had that was follow-up was what was the question again that you had about millennials?
Just really
about what these can do to.
Yeah, what could they do to help better communicate and understand with the not just millennials, but also as Generation Z is coming into the workplace, that they can start thinking about?
Got it. Okay, so there's this huge talk about diversity, and that can be in terms of ethnicity or age. And so here's the main way you can turn, say, differences in the workplace into a competitive advantage. You need to open up communication pipelines. And someone might say, what the heck is that? Well, people think that if you have diverse backgrounds, you have diverse perspectives, which can solve a problem better. That's true. But the breakdown occurs is when, let's say, 3 people on the team know the solution to a problem, but the manager doesn't. It's not unless those people speak up will the problem be solved. So the pipeline might be, say, what sort of systems do you have in place that you're actually having those conversations to, I guess you can say, harness the knowledge of other people. Things such as one-on-one meetings, surveys, brainstorming sessions, right? All of those, if you have those in place, are able to take those ideas and then put them out in the open. So then the people who have, say, or managers or directors who have the experience to know what a good idea is can evaluate them and then leverage the diversity in that environment and execute on that. That's how you actually make the workplace a competitive, or diversity in generations a competitive advantage. Just like with your son, when you set up the camera, you had to know he had a better way of accomplishing that than you did. There's some conversation that had to happen, or you had to witness it. And then as a leader, you had to drop your ego and say, okay, I am going to let them run the controls here to accomplish this main goal. But since you're the leader in that environment, you had to make those two observations as: one, they can solve it better than I can, and two, I need to give them the power or the authority to actually execute on that.
Yeah,
and it doesn't matter the age, it's just being in that leadership position. If someone on your team has that ability, it's how do you actually get that executed? And that's part of the process.
Well, I love one of the suggestions you said, and I've seen that in some real dynamics come out, is in the brainstorming session. You know, getting your people together. It could be your department, your area. It could be, you know, your people in the organization, not just the leaders, everyone, and do some brainstorming and have some really questions of how could we create some efficiencies in our area or in our department or in our company, depending on how large of an organization you are, and then split up the diversity levels and put people in different levels. So they have to work with other people and that's not in their same generation, but also this not in maybe even in their same department. And you can see some real magic happen there and some light bulbs start to go on. And what happens? Normally there's some of those people that maybe they've looked down to, they have some of the best ideals and solutions that's there, but they're not giving them to the organization because they've kind of been shut down.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. And I think if you have like someone who's a listener, who's maybe a director or manager who says, yeah, that's great, but you know, so-and-so doesn't work hard. I think the biggest takeaway I can give someone who's struggling with different generations is that it's not that in your workplace environment, you have to make it more cushy and nice and drop your expectations on employees. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem for a lot of people is that if they're not comfortable with upholding those expectations and knowing how to backfill accordingly, then there's an issue. So let's say that you have a new entry-level sales position and the new employees slacking off, and you say, oh, these millennials don't know how to do anything. They're all awful. It's like, well, it's kind of a reflection on you. Like, why aren't you able to uphold your standards? And why are you allowing someone to do that in your workplace? And you might say, well, I can't replace them. And I said, well, that's the main problem then. It's like, why aren't you able to replace people more effectively who meet your level of expectation?
Yeah, and setting really the parameters and being willing to kind of change your mindset. You know, talk about paradigm a lot. It's really for leaders and for organizations right now, really has to change their paradigm. I mean, there's so many gifts that's brought to different diversities and having that generational differences that's there. I mean, and let's be honest, you're going to have to do it. Because, I mean, I've saw multiple studies. You may have more current one, Jeff, but I've seen multiple studies that say this year of 2020, you know, 50% of your workforce are going to be millennials. And you got generation coming in right behind that. There's not enough boomers and Xers to do it. So you as a leader, just like if you have a challenge in your business of not enough profit or the production line is challenged, you dig into that. Well, you better dig in the leadership of how do we really change our organization to meet the needs of the people in the organization.
Right.
Is there any studies or anything through your psychology? You know, we stated at the very beginning that article that or piece from Peter the Hermit, and you quote Socrates. Is there anything that you see there that you're seeing where some of the changes that you think the dynamics it is going to is changing, or is it just a workplace dynamic that we're going to have to continue to work on?
Well, if you're looking at more of the macro level changes, Gallup research is very good at summarizing some of those macro level of changes. If it's more on the ground level, that really depends down to your listeners and the industry that they're in.
because each industry is affected differently. As when I was in Missouri, when you first saw me, like their big issue is that they're not even able to bring in nearly as many millennials or young cadets or candidates for positions as previous years. And they say that we don't know how to manage them. It's like, well, you only have like 5 applicants and you take 2. That's a pretty low pool to choose from.
Yeah.
So there's that issue versus tech. And they're like, how do we get people to stay? Because they're always leaving. So you have these different dynamics. So I would definitely macro level, go to Gallup research the individual industry. I wouldn't trust as much that you find online at large publications as much. I would more try and lean towards Harvard Business Review or HR News for looking into differences in generations or how do people actually work with people of different demographics. Because I find that a lot of people on these major medias, I don't want to say them specifically, but just say they rank the best in SEO, and a lot of them out there just try and get clicks. And if you look at the actual person's bio, it's like they're not even, they maybe studied psychology a bit, but they didn't actually manage anyone in their career.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and it becomes the real key is you've got to be willing. Are you willing to work on it? And then, as you've spoke of, really is getting to the root cause of digging down in your organization. What's going to change that culture, that dynamics to create that where you create some cohesive teams instead of it's being we versus them. It becomes we, or we become a team in that manner that's there. Well, Jeff, we've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, but I thought maybe the last part of it I'd leave open to you is some of the things that you're seeing or anything that you'd like to bring forward yet that we haven't covered before we head into our recharge round.
The main thing that I would probably put forward is that if you do have people who are of different demographics, say younger generations in your workplace, a lot of the times they have the answer to the questions that people ask. For instance, how do you recruit? Why do people stay? Why do people leave? And if you sit down and actually have that conversation, you'll learn more than probably any podcast you can listen to. And part of it is that you're actually in the field and you're harnessing the knowledge of other people in your company. And that's one of the true things that a leader can do.
I think that's an excellent one is go to your folks that are taking those positions. It's with you currently and just ask them, what could we do to recruit more, to be a better employer, those things, and be open to it. That's the key of a leader is that you're willing to hear what you need to hear,
Right.
And that sometimes is tough for us, but that's really where progress happens and you can really move yourself forward. I truly appreciate you sharing with us today, Jeff, and then some great information, and there's more information that they can receive. And if you would share your website, so if they want to look you up and check out, I know you got some great videos on your website and everything else that they can check you out and they can get more information on you.
Yeah, my website is jeffjbutler.com. Not Jeff Butler, jeffjbutler.com. Jeff Butler absolutely is frustrated with me because people always email him instead of me. And so we can just type in Jeff Butler speaker into Google and I'll be the first search result.
Okay. So check him out. You got his website that you can go to, and we'll have that in show notes too. So if you're exercising or doing something else right now and can't write it down, it will be in show notes at chargepodcast.com. Jeff, if you don't mind, I'm going to have you go through the recharge round with me real quickly here. I ask these questions to every guest, and it's kind of get the understanding. It's kind of my framework that I speak a lot about, and I like sharing different perspectives of how they believe that. So my first one with you is your mindset. How do you think that affects your daily living?
Well, my mindset is what drives my individual actions. Right? If I had an absolutely awful mindset, I'll put up mental barriers that would basically shut down what I think could be impossible. Right? The mindset is sort of the speedometer of which you think you're supposed to redline. And it's what you decide to do, your goals, your direction. I mean, it's one of the catalysts of the success of someone's life is their mindset. So I think it's almost mostly responsible for my success today is my mindset.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. The reason I keep asking people that, and we get similar question answers, is I want the listeners to realize we're early in 2020. And they've made some decisions either at the end of last year or New Year's, or at some point they told themselves they wanted to do something different. They want to make a change. It doesn't matter if it's health, wealth, work, or what it is. We've made some of those choices. Well, you heard early on, Jeff said, write it down. That will help you a big thing. But truly about creating habits around you to achieve your goals is really setting your mindset up for success. Because probably now it's a few weeks in, the year has started now, we start the wane on some of those things that we had momentum early on. But your mindset is the one thing that can really help you move forward in that. So I appreciate you sharing that like that, because I wanted to bring that to light. How about your energy? You know, it's easy when we're on stage because we love to speak to audiences and visit with them. But I'm going to take the example of the days you don't have as much energy. Jeff, what do you do there to generate it so you can continue to have the momentum for everything that you want to achieve?
Yeah, and that's a great point to bring up, because it turns out that 30% of entrepreneurs actually suffer from depression. And I definitely have my struggles where I have bad days, and part of it is there's two major things. One is that if you're really down in the dumps, it's taking out a journal and just start writing whatever's on your mind. What you'll find is that if you just continue writing, within 20 minutes, you'll probably be at the source of what the problem is. That's one way. The other way is called state changes. And very often that we're sitting down working all day and you might feel upset. Your body needs to get up and move a little bit and release a little bit of endorphins and dopamine. And sometimes going on a quick run or working out a bit will definitely create that endorphin shift and change the mental state that you're in.
Great suggestions. Thanks for sharing that. How about the number one connection that's made the biggest impact on your life?
It depends on what part, because every phase of my life, there was always some major connection. It was never that I met one person and it completely changed my life and continued to change my life over and over again. I think in terms of, if you want to look at milestones, and the biggest milestone person who was there would be Tor Gustafsson, who was a 3-time Olympic hammer thrower. And he ended up being my coach for track and field. I decided to do track and field the last year of high school. And that last year of high school, I got picked up by a D1 program and ended up getting into Cal Berkeley because of that. But if I didn't meet him, I wouldn't have had a great coach in my corner who would have got me to the level where I needed to be, spotted and got into my university.
Huh, that's interesting. That is a great story. It just shows you never know who could be that next connection that really can move you forward in your life.
He was the family chiropractor. Like, he's right there. But then there's all these Olympic medals on the wall. And you're like, oh, who is that? Oh, that's all my athletes. I'm like, oh, can you teach our kids? So yeah, it's like, it could be right there. You just have to open your eyes.
What advice has influenced you the most in life, Jeff?
People who are older than me, who have more wisdom.
Be willing to listen to it. Great. How about a book that you love? Share why you love it.
Book that I love and why do I love it? So there's always points of your life where you would read one question or one line from a book that changes your life completely. And the one that happened for me was a really funny book. It was called Maximum Achievement by Brian Tracy. And I'm a computer science guy. I was reading personal development at that time, but they had one question in there that completely changed my whole life on its head. And the one question was, what would you do if you had the most ideal future in 5 years? And it was a simple question in there, but like, no one asked me that. It was always in interviews, where do you see your career progression in 5 years? It was never, what life would you like to have? No one asked me that in my entire life. And I sat down and I wrote down what I wanted, and I realized I am not living this dream. And that completely changed where I wanted to do with my life.
That makes a big inflection point in your life. Well, we're in 2020 now, a new decade. So can I put you on the spot? If you looked at this next decade, and not every little thing, but what's the big aspiration you have for this decade?
My aspirations usually work within 5-year chunks, because what I find is when I get to a certain goal, the person who I am has changed.
Sure.
So there are so there are aspects where I have financial goals to get to a certain point. One thing I want to do is have a New York Times best-selling book on there. There are certain weightlifting goals, so I still compete in weightlifting to this day. So there's a whole bunch of those, but all different parts of life, and they're quantifiable. And I don't know if you want me to list down go through the list, but there's quite a few.
No, I love the New York. We'll take just the New York best time seller. We're going to see him do that. Already has a couple books out ready. And I will be cheering you on to there, and we'll help you get you to that finish line. And that's the thing about it, when you tell people that, there's others that are willing to help get you there. That's the fun part. I'm going to end it with this question for you. What legacy do you want to leave the world?
The legacy that I want to leave to the world is there's one that I want to be remembered by, and the legacy. So the one I want to be remembered by is someone who would explore the intricacies of the mind to see what people are capable of. Mm-hmm. The legacy itself would be under, I guess, the doctrine of really realizing that what sort of power an individual can really have and the potential within them.
I love that, because we all have that potential, and someone here today needed to hear that.
And yeah, it's really cheesy, and I hear that a lot, where you have Tony Robbins seminars, they pump you up and they tell you to run through a brick wall. Like, that's not really what I'm talking about. More as like, you might have read my bio, but growing up, I had life-threatening illnesses, and there's all these things that everyone has something bad happen in their life, and they are still at the same time capable of so much. Not necessarily that they change the world, but they can change their world to fit in a way that they can be happy with.
Very well said. Chargers, I think you have the opportunity now to go out and change your world. And while some of you are changing your world, you will change others' world, because we impact those as we go forward. Jeff, I just can't thank you enough for being on the Charge podcast. Share with us again, if you would, your website. So if people want to look you up, they can do that.
Sure. JeffJButler.com.
And of course, remember, that will be in show notes. And Jeff, we just can't thank you enough for sharing with us and being willing to say yes to the Charge podcast. Thanks again for joining us.
Sure thing, Gary. Pleasure being here.
Chargers, I hope that charges you up. I'm charged up, ready to go. I'm ready to go through that brick wall. I'm ready to work on getting my goals that I set out earlier this year in 2020 that I want to accomplish. I hope you have those written down for you so you can achieve those goals also. Remember, the phrase is charge, because it's about create habits around real goals every day. When you do that, you're more likely to achieve them. Thanks for joining us again for another great podcast, and thanks for Jeff being our guest today. And I tell you, if you're having some trouble getting that charge and need some help, I've got something for you. For the listeners of the Charge podcast, I'm going to offer you the 7-day charge program absolutely free. This program will take you in just a few minutes each day, has a video with some downloads, and will drastically change your life. You can get this free program by going over to positiveculturewins.biz. And that's my gift to you for listening to the Charge podcast. Remember, tell others about the podcast. Come back next week and listen to another great guest. And we'll see you back here next week. Make it a great day.
This podcast is ended, but your life doesn't just stop. To continue your inspiring journey, head over to chargepodcast.com and access all the tools and resources mentioned on today's show. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing with somebody who may also benefit from the advice provided. That's chargepodcast.com. Until next time, charge in business and life.